Well, good morning. So we had our prayer. I'm going to just put everyone on mute here for a second, but please unmute yourself if you want to share or ask a question or be part of the discussion. We also have a chat box down at the bottom where you can ask questions or make comments to those on the recording or to me, so we can always get the conversation going. So let me make sure that everybody's on mute. I think so. Okay, great. So the week before Christmas and all through the house.
Yes. Merry Christmas.
I have something.
Yeah.
It's a comment more than a question.
Okay.
I'm having to collect myself to have this, to make Christmas a spiritual event more than a secular one. I'm busy with family and everything. So I have to kind of work at it every day that this is about Jesus being born and coming into my life, rather than all the other stuff that I'm doing. And I'm open to suggestions how to make that happen a little bit more. I do it at Mass, I get it collected at Mass, and then I go about my day and I have to remember that it's all about a spiritual coming.
Could anybody on the Zoom hear what Gretchen was saying? No. So it was a good comment. It's a good question, and maybe it's a good topic for our week before Christmas. I think Gretchen's comment or concern was, if I'm understanding it right, Gretchen, you tell me if I'm getting it wrong, but question was, how can I maintain a sense of the sacred, or how can I enter into Christmas as a spiritual event amidst all the chaos of the secular celebration of Christmas? Does that sound like a good topic for today? So we'll discuss that a little bit. Okay, so thank you, Gretchen. That's always a good place to start. Dorothy Berry, who's not on our call today, but we were talking a little bit earlier this week about the same thing. What's the meaning of Christmas? And she said, if I were to ask a question on the Zoom this week, it would be, what does it mean to be a child? Or also we could maybe ask also, what does it mean for God to come to us in the form of a child? So what is the real meaning of Christmas, and how can we celebrate? What's the proper way to enter into it? What is Christmas after all? Huh? Yeah, and I think maybe before we talk about those questions, what does it mean to be a child? Why did he come as a child? Why does Jesus enjoin us in the gospel to be like children? That's really the heart of the matter there. But it's worth noting before we start that discussion that Christmas is celebrated by us because of the resurrection. If Christ is not risen from the dead, then our faith is in vain. So really the seminal defining mystery of the Christian faith is the resurrection, not the birth of Christ. So we celebrate his birth because it foretells the resurrection, not the other way around. Now, for most of us growing up, Christmas was, at least for me, Christmas was a lot bigger celebration than Easter. You know, I got chocolate at Easter, but I got presents at Christmas. So Christmas had more heft to it. And we'll talk about the resurrection more when it comes to Easter. But so we celebrate Easter, we celebrate Christmas. We remember his birth because there was something mysterious about his death. And the mystery of his death is that somehow he transcended death. So yeah, we'll talk a lot more about that when we come to the resurrection. So, but looking back, we look at the incarnation and we think, why did he, what's all tied up in becoming like a little child? Right.
Humility.
Well, yeah. So I think I mentioned to you last week that and maybe I sent you that link to the
Yeah,
YouTube video
yeah,
about the near-death experience. And
Did you talk with the guy?
yeah, so I had a chat with the man who made who did the witness, and he tells his story quite often now and in many various different groups. And we had about a half an hour conversation. It was very, very wonderful. And he was just as authentic in the conversation with me as he was on the YouTube. But one thing he said towards the end of our conversation, one of the things that he says often in his testimony, and this will probably muddy the waters here a little today, so I hesitate even to say it, but he was talking that when he had this experience of God, and when he had the experience of his soul separating from his body, which is the event of death, really, that's what happens, our soul. And you know, if you watch any more of those videos, and you don't have to put any faith in these at all, I find them very affirming of what we already believe. You know, that what caught my eye about his testimony was that he said, I saw God and I lost my faith. And of course, when he explained that, he said, my experience of God was so overwhelming and so definitive for my life that it rendered my need to believe non-existent. I no longer had to have faith in anything. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. So it's a curious way to say it. I lost faith. And what I said to this guy was, I said, as you described your experience of the divine, he talks about it as of the divine. And here's where I might muddy the waters a little bit, but I don't think I will, because I'll parlay it into what we want to talk about today. But towards the end of our conversation, or in his other videos, he often says, people ask him, when you died, did you see Jesus? And he said, no, I absolutely did not. He said, Jesus was a no-show for me. He said, a lot of people who die, have those near-death experiences, do encounter Jesus. He said, but I did not. He said, I encountered light and love. He said 2 words for God, light and love. And I was drawn into the light, then I was pulled back from the light, and I've regretted it ever since. He said, because I was given the choice whether I wanted to come back. And I came back because my mother had just lost her daughter. Her daughter had run away and I guess died of an overdose or something similar. And he said, if I die on this mountain, I'm going to break my mother's heart. So I'll go back. And he said, as soon as I went back, I regretted my decision. I regretted it ever since, because God even showed me when I was with him that my mother would be just fine, and that she was loved with the same infinite love that I'm loved with. And all of the pain that we experience in this life becomes immediately irrelevant upon our encounter with the light. And he said, not only does it become irrelevant, but it also becomes almost, now I'm paraphrasing what he said, and I'm giving you now a composite of many near-death experiences that I've either read about or watched myself. And so what I said to him was, I said, you know, Peter, everything you describe, I have felt like I have intuitively known from my childhood. I said, I've always known an inexpressible love. My mother used to say, you don't know what to do with yourself, do you? And I said, no, I don't. I never felt like I fit in. I never felt like anything would really satisfy. You know, you could write it off to ADHD, I suppose, but it wasn't that. It was feeling like I was an alien in this world somehow. And in truth, we are kind of aliens in this world because we come from God and we return to God and we pass through. And as my friend Peter always says, he goes like this. He says, our life is this long.
Really?
Yeah, he says, that's our life. It's a blink. So who we are and where we're going and where we're from is so far, so infinitely greater than that, and so infinitely more beautiful than that. So at the end of our conversation, he said, you know, he said, for me, it's boiled down to two simple things. There's God and there's not God. And he said, we live in the world of not God. However, we are made for God, and God is in us. And so one of the things he talks about is, what was revealed to, what he kind of instantaneously knew. And this is the experience of the saints as well. You read any mystic, you read something very similar to this. They won't talk about near-death experiences, but a mystical experience is a kind of a momentary transcending death without having a near-death experience. Because the life of God that is in us is deathless. We are not going to die. We are going to assume a different form of life. So we have life within us. We have life from life. We have light from light. We are gods, small g, gods from God. So when this, and I'm just using this as a foil today into our topic about being little children and what it means to have Christmas faith and what Christmas really means. So one of the things that he said immediately was, he said, I talk about these things sequentially when I had my near-death experience. I don't know how long I was dead. He said, when I came back to my body, my climbing partner, he had frozen to death. His partner was still alive, but they were stranded on a mountain in sub-zero weather with inadequate equipment. So they both had severe frostbite. They were both had hypothermia. They were lucky to be alive. And he says he literally died. And he said when he came back to, his partner had been shaking him for several minutes saying, you can't die, you can't die. So how long he was gone, he doesn't know. His partner can't remember because his concept of time was blurred by the hypothermia. So he said, everything I describe on the other side, I describe it as if it happened in a sequence. He said, but it all happened simultaneously. He said, I knew everything simultaneously. He said, when I came back here, I can't remember anything of anything. He says, I understood everything. I understood the mathematical coordination of the universe. I understood how everything fits together. I understood how every misstep I had taken was somehow integrated into a greater goodness by God. He said, I instantaneously knew that my whole life was a life of wasted worry. I knew it beyond a shadow of a doubt. And now I'm trying to retain that sense of luminosity now that I'm back in this world. But one of the things he said, I also realized, he says, because I heard a voice, not audibly, but the voice and the presence of love. He says it was absolutely the experience of God. But it wasn't for him, it wasn't Trinitarian. I even asked him, was there a Trinitarian or Christological dimension to your experience? He says, absolutely not. It was me and the divine. And that doesn't mean everything we talk about here is not true. In fact, I'm going to talk a little more about the Trinity today, because I believe his experience of the light was Trinitarian without him necessarily using that language or using those concepts to grasp it. But regardless, he said instantaneously he knew, the voice said to him in some form or another, he said the main thing that struck him with such joy was the realization, and he said it was a kind of voice, but it was an inaudible voice communicating to him, I have always loved you. I have loved you from all eternity. I have chosen you. I know you. You are known by me. You will always be known by me. There's nothing you can do. Your existence is my doing. And it was so overwhelmingly a sense of gift and gratitude for him, and he said, I realized that, and he says, my experience of God was light and love, or beauty and love. And he said, I realized I came from that light, the light that was in me. So here's where I ask a clarifying question of him, because I've taught this for all my life, and I wanted to make sure it was absolutely sure. And even if he said it wasn't, I would still believe it was absolutely true. But anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So he said, I realized that I was light from light. My existence came from the light. That's why I'm known by the light. He didn't say I'm a part of the light. He said in his testimony, which I've watched several times on YouTube, he said, I was like a photon that came out of the light. So the life of the light is in me, and my life comes from the light. And he may even say, I'm a part, you and I, all people, are a part of the light. Now, so I said to him, I said, the other thing he said was, when my soul was separated from my body, I think I shared this with you last week, and all these things that I'm telling you now about him, I don't want us to get focused on near-death experiences. I don't want anybody on YouTube or the videos watching this down the line to be put off by near-death experiences if you think it's too new agey. I'm just using this as a point of not comparison, but a point of illumination for what we believe as Catholic Christians around the mystery of the incarnation, the mystery of the Trinity. Okay, but it can be very helpful. It can be very affirming. And he said, now, what did I do? I just lost my place a little bit. So he said, he didn't exactly say I'm part of the light. Oh, the other thing he said, the other powerful realization, in addition that I came from the light and I am known, the other realization was, what was it there? Boy, I'm telling you, my mind really, it slips here.
He wasn't a religious man.
Yeah, he was. He had been raised Catholic and Orthodox. His father was Orthodox, his mother was Catholic. The other realization. So let's just stay with that part. He said, I was light from light, and I was known by God from all eternity, and that I would always be known by God. And so one of the things, but it's right on the tip of my memory here. I've got to remember this because it's so important, but I'll stick with the part I do remember.
How you were talking about how he was possibly gonna say something, how we're all part of that or something?
Well, we all come from the light, so we are all known by God. We're all infinitely loved by God, and we will all infinitely return to God. He did talk about having a life review. He did talk about what we would call in our terms purgatory and hell. It's all those episodes of unlove. He describes sin simply as the hurt that human beings cause to one another, either intentionally or unintentionally. But it was this point about being of the light, but not being identical with the light, And I remember it now. He said, the other realization I had when my soul separated from my body, immediately, my true name was spoken to me. Did I tell you that the last time?
Yeah.
No.
So he says the separation of the soul from the body is the destruction of the ego. It's the immediate dissolution of the ego. So our ego is not identical with our body. That would be Gnosticism. The body's not evil. The body belongs to the soul, actually. The soul doesn't belong to the body. The body belongs to the soul. The body is given to the soul or to the person or to the who that God created us to be, to express the who that God created us to be, and to communicate the love of the person that God created us to be. Because in our foundational identity, we are love. We are light. We come from God with a unique identity. And that's what I asked him about. He said, the moment my soul separated from my body, I knew who I truly was. He said, I felt like myself for the first time in my life. And he said, I heard the name that God had given me in my conception by God before the foundation of the world, the name that's known only to God. If you look in the book of Revelations, chapter 2, verse 17, you'll see there that God talks about the saints meeting him, and he says there, each God has a white stone for each person where their true name is written on the backside of the stone. And God shows that name to people when they come into God's presence. So there is an identity that each of us has. All those are metaphors for the real reality, that each of us has an identity in God that is infinitely loved, infinitely known, and infinitely beautiful, perfect in every way because it comes from God. And God is perfect in every way. So we emerge, as it were, from the life of God as created entities of light and love that are created for the purpose of manifesting the glory of the one who conceived us. Does that make sense? Everybody with me there? Okay, well, he described it as I'm a photon who came from the light. So when we were having our conversation, I said, let me see if I can, I said, I want to ask you if I'm getting this right. I said, because I've intuitively always felt this, and your photon image doesn't quite describe the way that I believe it actually is. I said, when people ask me, who is the human person or who are you? I always tell them, I think this is how the human being should think of him or herself. I am he who is. So Patty could say, I am she who is in him who is I am. So I said to Peter, I said, the best description I know of for my own identity and the identity of every other human person is to say, I am he who is in him who is I am. And he jumped up off his seat and he says, I've never heard it put so well. He said, that's exactly what I experienced. I in God, God in me, but God and I not identical. And he says, that's exactly what it is. And I said, so it is true. I said, let me just clarify here because this is what I teach and this is what I believe. And I want to ask you if this is what you experienced. That when you were revealed your true identity in God, even though the ego was gone, there was still an identity that was unique to you. In other words, there was still a me, a non-egoic me that remains connected to God and derivative from God, but not identical with God, but has the life of God in him or her. Is that accurate? He said, I couldn't say it better. He said, that's exactly what it is. So you see, there is this distinction. The human person is not a part of the light, but the human person, each of us, derives our entire existence. We have nothing of our own. Even the I that we utter is God's I for us. And yet we are mysteriously allowed to behold that in ourselves. We are bystanders to our own lives, as it were. God has allowed us to know ourselves as a function of how he knows us. But it's his knowledge of us that makes it possible for us to be in the first place and for us to know that we are in the second place. Wow. Okay, you'll have to watch the recording to understand that one again, but it's very true. What I just said is very true, but I don't think I could repeat it just this second.
Does he remember his name?
He said the name was ineffable, just like the name of God is unspeakable. In other words, it's so, and this gets back, this will lead us into our discussion of Christmas and what it means to be like a child. The things of God, the love of God, the existence of God, the light of God, it is uncreated. In my conversation with Peter, I said, when you talk about the light, the phrase that I always use to grasp the complete otherness of God, the complete transcendence of God, the complete non-dependence of God on me or us or anything else. The phrase from the early church fathers that always comes back to me when I think of God is God is the uncreated light from which light comes. So everything about God precedes anything precedes and exceeds anything we can conceive of in our world or in the cosmos in general. That's what Peter meant by, he said, there's God and then there's not God. Okay. And everything that is not God is as nothing compared to God. And it is nothing without God. So the whole of everything is nothing in itself, except as an extension of God's desire that it be. Does that make sense? Yes, I can't tell. Okay. So I'll just, maybe I'll come at it from this angle. So another one of the near-death experiences that I was watching last week, they asked this lady, and I don't think it was Peter, but I think it was somebody else. They said, well, what about our sins? And as I said from Peter's example, people do become aware of their sins in this experience of God's infinite love. And there is apparently, and we believe this, there is a kind of purgatorial or even kind of hellish awakening that takes place. The soul is made aware in the light of God of everything that is not of God in their earthly lifetime. And it must be like fingernails on the blackboard, because if even good things don't appear very beautiful in the light of God, I mean, when these people come back with the light of God still in them, they come back and they see a beautiful sunset in this world, or they see a baby be born, or they see what we would account for beauty, and they're unmoved by it. Basically, you know, this guy, Peter Panagore is his name. He said, the only way I can describe this life compared to that life is like a cartoon. This is a cartoon version of reality. So he can't get excited about anything in this world. And yet the things in this world are given to us by God to try to draw us into this mystical experience of God before we have to die. In other words, that's what all the saints have said. Die before you die, and the light of God that you will see in its fullness on the other side of death will break upon you. The dawn from on high shall break upon you. You know, the song of Zechariah there. So one of these people said, well, you know, when you enter the light of God, everything that is not of God appears to be as darkness. But one form of darkness is in a certain sense, no darker than any other form of darkness. It all seems trivial by comparison. So one person in this context described her sins. She said, when God, who created us in love, for love, and with love, when he shows us the unloving things that we either intentionally or inadvertently did, he said he shows them to you like a mother might be showing a video to her grown-up children about when they were toddlers and they were fighting with each other, or they bumped their head on the furniture and they started screaming, or they made a mess. It looks as silly. The sins of the human race are like missteps that a toddler makes, and the father or mother doesn't get mad at the toddler. They don't know any better. You know, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. So from God's standpoint, we are all always children. So we never grow old in God's sight. You know, we always, just like a parent, I suppose, you know, even, I mean, I told you about the times that when I was in the seminary and they assigned me to San Quentin prison, you know, to go work with the worst of the worst. So for a year, I strode the halls of the death row in San Quentin prison. So you
Wow.
can't get any, I mean, Charles Manson was on that floor, you know, people
Wow.
like that, high class, world class criminals,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, I'd meet a woman walking the halls, and it would inevitably be the mother of one of the prisoners there, you know, and occasionally one would say, you know, if you knew him like I do, you would still love him. And then, you know, that line of Jesus always, when I hear something like that, and I know it's true, you know, I always say a mother's love is the strongest love on the face of the earth, whether a mother and her cubs or a mother and her children. She'd gladly exchange any suffering they have for her own if they could only be so. You know, and that line of Jesus always pops into mind when I think of that human dynamic of a mother with her child, even on death row. If you who are evil know how to do the right things for your kids, how much more so will my Father in heaven do good by those whom he loves? So, so what I, you know, as I thought about, you know, answering Dorothy's question, what does it mean to be a child? And what does it mean to God to come as a child? And what does it mean for Jesus to say to us, unless you become as little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven? You know, with the latter phrase there, unless you become as little children, we certainly, you know, we have to reassume somehow the mindset of a child whose joy is kind of immediate and whose critical faculties are not developed at all. You know, they just see they're, you know, at Christmas, you know, kids are happy, just as happy, real little kids are just as happy playing with the wrapping paper as they are with the present, you know. I've always said, just get them boxes for Christmas with nothing inside and they'll crawl around in them. They'll think this is great, you know. So there's a naivete and a non-critical, non-cognitive, their lives are not gummed up with anxiety. I mean, they may have momentary frustration when their diaper is wet or their sister took their toy. But when they fight, you know, we separate them, but we don't punish them necessarily. We might say, take a time out here and think about this. But with little children, even our relations with them are governed by a certain spaciousness. You know, we give them space, we give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, that's even stating it too
They're just
strongly. They don't need the benefit of the doubt. They're just children.
Innocent.
Yeah, so it's almost as if God says, and this is what Peter communicated in his near-death experience, when God was showing him his life review and allowing him to experience, not only see the pain he had caused others, but allow him to experience what they were experiencing, to show him that every person within the human body is connected. Everything you do to one redounds to the other. And he said, in my mystical understanding, I understood how the whole of humanity is interconnected and every pain here affects everybody else. And in God's view, that's very clear. But in our view, it's not. So we get boxed up into these little atomized compartments of individuals and we think my life's my own and I live my life my own and it's me and God, but it's not. I am connected to everybody else and I am my relationships and who I am and how I get in touch with the light within me, how I make a conscious yes. See, this is Mary saying, let it be to me according to your word. So God creates us as photons or as units of his glory and his light and love, with an interiority of our own that can, as it were, there's kind of in our soul, there's kind of like you know, what's the kind of knob we have here? You know, you can turn it up and down. A dimmer. Yeah, there's a dimmer in our souls. So our cooperating with what we would call grace, or cooperating with the light of God, or cooperating with the spirit of love or beauty, when we do that, the light in us gets turned up and the light in the world gets turned up. When we go in the opposite direction, the light gets turned down and maybe even goes off, at least as far as we can see it. But the power is always still there. And that's the power of God in us. That's the power in the life and light of God in us. So it's either God or not God. So that which is not God, which is us, we are all, everything that is created is constantly at every second completely dependent on its source for its being. And so everything vis-a-vis God, everything with respect to God has a kind of, it's born of God. Everything that is born of God. It's the Holy Spirit who brings the cosmos into creation, and it's the Holy Spirit that brings Jesus into the womb of Mary. So the world comes from God, but it is birthed by the Holy Spirit. And its inner coherence and its inner structure is the divine word, the divine logos. The logos is the connectivity of everything that exists. Christ is a person, is an individual human being, the Son of Mary, but he is also the inner form, the inner structure, the inner coherence of the entire cosmos, and in particular of the human race. So that which binds us together is the second person of the Trinity. So that everything vis-a-vis God has been midwifed into existence by God. So the whole world, in a way, is the child of God, is the creation of God. And in its own way, the flowers and the trees and the streams and the stars and created reality in its own way glorifies God simply by being who it is. It doesn't, animals, there's violence in the animal world, but it's not a continual violence. It's an establishment of territory. And there is there's no moral wiggle room in there, because they're just instinctual reactions that happen in the animal kingdom to establish a kind of a homeostasis among the strong and the weak. Everybody finds their own place in creation, and that place in creation has been decided and determined by God in his ineffable, infinite, pre-eternal wisdom, as a form of manifesting the glory of his Son and of himself. So creation is resplendent with the glory of God in both its order and in its multiple variety. And in the human race in particular, we have the further capacity within us by God's grace to say yes, to be aware of from whence we come, to be grateful from whence we come, to be aware of the uses of our interiority or our freedom. It's not really freedom when we sin. When we sin, we are slaves to sin. So we are not really free. We don't really have freedom till we have learned, till God has brought us into a place of communion with light and love, with the Son and the Spirit. You can think of the Son as the light of God. You can think of the Spirit as the love of God. They all these qualities of God are essentially the same mystery. We imagine them in a Trinitarian way, which is true in the heart of God. What was I just saying? So we don't really, the goal of our life is to acquire freedom, and freedom means through hit and miss, through helter skelter, through trial and error is the phrase I'm looking for. Through trial and error, we find that certain ways of living our life bring us into kind of they bring us into suffering. They bring us into it. They bring us into a metaphorical kind of darkness. We despair of life. We despair of our children. We despair of the world. We feel desolation. That's a sign. That's a gift from God. Desolation is a gift from God. Say it's a trial and error. In your ignorance, as a toddler, you are banging you keep going down. You keep putting your hand on that hot stove. It's going to burn. Sooner or later,
Stop doing it.
the consequences themselves will move you in a different direction. So life is the banging into the things of life as ignorant toddlers. This is how we live. Now we have wisdom out there. We have guides. We have authority figures and parents, priests and the Pope and the rest of them, and Moses and the commandments, and even Jesus in the gospel. Here's some guidelines you can use that'll keep you from causing yourself suffering. But even with all the guidelines, we still bang into things, and we do still things that cause us suffering. Okay, and we think that we're actually acting in freedom when we're doing that, but we're not really acting in freedom. We're acting in blindness. We are going towards things that look like the light for us, towards an addiction of some kind, or towards the commercialism of Christmas. So it draws us. You know, I was watching a Notre Dame football broadcast today, and it's interesting. And it has some light in it. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting there, I realize I've been watching this nonsense for 45 minutes, you know, and it's not bad in itself, but it's not really connecting me to the light that comes from God. So life is mistaking the light for created objects, for created people. And it's hard not to be deceived, because everything that's created has the light of God in it. Food has the light of God in it. Alcohol has the light of God in it. Every molecule that's out there has the light of God in it. God has constellated those molecules in certain beautiful forms. So there are good-looking men, there are good-looking women, there are good-looking sunsets, there are great-looking meals, there are great-looking tables, there are great-looking lamps, there are great-looking automobiles. Everything is resplendent with a kind of light, and everything that God created is good. So the world is filled with the light of God, but the world is not God. And so all unfreedom, all sin and unfreedom are identical, and pain and suffering causing each other hurt is also the very definition of sin, because it comes from being deceived about the true light, the source of the true light. That's why we say evil is always a perversion of the good. The evil is always a lie. And this is where, just parenthetically here, my Christian universalism comes back to either inspire or to haunt us, because you cannot condemn a person for making a mistake when they've been deceived. And you can't indict them for being complicit in their own deception. They are deceived, and we are easily deceived. That's the whole point. And toddlers are especially easily deceived. But life itself can move us in the right direction. Normally, for most people, that means a great deal of suffering, where they realize I'm attached to all the wrong things here. It's not doing it for me anymore. And that can even happen for people in the practice of their religion. Even people who are doing it right will reach a point in their own practice of religion. This is John of the Cross now and Teresa of Avila. You go into the fifth and sixth mansions, which is a very devout and completely surrendered life to God, but there are still attachments there to things that are not in the interior castle. What she means by the interior castle is that deepest identity that I talked about earlier, where we are created perfect by God from all eternity, and now that perfect person inhabits this body in this world. But that perfect person is the only person God knows in you, and he looks with relative indifference at everything else you have become in your egoic deceptions with your life. Okay, so the goal in the spiritual life is to move from these egoic deceptions back into my true identity. And that begins by giving up the things that I've identified with myself with prior to this, and giving up things that I know are now harmful to me, even though I feel very attracted to them and very attached to them. I have to let go of everything that is not the uncreated light of God. That means starting to turn my attention inward rather than outward. Okay, and that's ultimately the goal for Christmas. I have to move, I have to go to the interior Bethlehem. I have to go to the interior Nazareth. I have to go to the interior Holy Land. We go to the external Holy Land to bring people to the interior Holy Land. And you never have to move from your dining room to go to the interior Holy Land. So that's the spiritual journey, okay? And that's the journey of becoming like a child again, being willing to be led into the darkness of your own self and discovering there the light of God and realizing I have an identity that is deeper than all the ones that I've crafted for myself or all the ones that other people have told me I'm supposed to have or think that I do have. And one of the things that I talked with Peter about as in light of his near-death experiences, because I said, isn't the separation of the soul from the body, that's not only the shattering of the ego, but it's the revelation of your true name. And he said, yes. And he said, another thing I understood or intuitively knew is that even in eternity, when I know my true name, there are all, he says, it's not exactly that you have an ego in the other world, but you do have an identity. You have a true you that you know is the real you. He said, that's why he said, I felt like myself for the first time because I'd shed the skin of this snake who thought he was such and such a thing. Good climber, a good divinity student. He was doing all kinds of good things, but he said, all that was gone. He said, I left it back there just like I left my body lying on the mountainside. He said it was just old. I wanted nothing to do with it.
There's this new identity that God sees have anything to do with the identities I have now.
Yes, it does, of course, but I'm not able to see it. So the question is, does the true identity that I will be seen upon my death and that is in me right now, does that have anything to do with me right now? And the answer is yes. All the conflicts in my life, any lack of peace that I have in my life means that there are still pebbles in my shoe from my ego, keeping me from living completely out of my true self, out of my egoless identity in God, which is this body is in union with that true identity of God, but there's a veil between my true identity and the ego keeps me from, the ego continues to deceive me because my ego is the inheritance of the deceiver. So it's a veil. All the people talk about a veil. And when he was shown the earth in his near-death experience, he could see a veil that covered everybody in this world, preventing them from seeing themselves as God sees them. Now, there are people, for whom the veil either completely disappears or gets so gossamer thin that they can see through it. We're talking people like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. Anybody who's a mystic kind of knows who they really are. And really, as John of the Cross says, God desires that everybody live from their true identity. It's just that the deception is so strong and the deceiver is so powerful, and we are so weak in ourselves, through generations of inheriting an egoic identity as nations, as people, as races, as families, as this or that.
We spend our whole life building an image of ourselves.
Correct. We spend our whole lives building a nothingness for ourselves. The goal is to get rid of it now because it will be taken away from you. Peter said, I never fight with people who don't believe what I'm saying. I always say to them, you'll find out. You'll find out. It just happens automatically. You have no control over it. When the angel of death comes for your soul, you see him coming. He says, I resisted, but resistance was futile. He said, I've come to take you. And I went and, first into darkness, then into light. Yeah, but it's this true identity. So all the choices we make that cause us suffering or even cause us pleasure, none of those choices are exactly free. We make them in a deliberative kind of way. We choose to go to church. We choose to go watch the Notre Dame video on the YouTube. We think we're acting freely. But until we discover ourselves as God knows us. Oh, this is the other thought I forgot to finish there for a second. He said, not only is your true identity, your true name instantly revealed to you the moment you enter the presence of God. And of course, you're always in the presence of God, even in this body. It's just that it's not as vivid to you because of this world and because of the ego, as it will be when your soul separates from this world. And then you're in the world of God. He said, but even in that world, when your true identity is revealed to you, every moment in that world, a deeper depth of your true identity is revealed to you. In other words, there's a kind of, the identity that you think is your true, there's always a depth to your true name that is even beyond your reach in eternity, just as there is a depth to God that is beyond your grasp in eternity. No person will ever grasp God in eternity. They will know the presence of God, and they will know that everything they are and have and always have had comes from God. And they will be in ecstatic gratitude of being in this relationship with God. And at every moment, how much God loves them and how God loves them will be revealed to them at a deeper and more expansive level. And then I said to Peter, and this process of continual revelation of your true self in God, I said it'll continue for eternity. He says, that's right. It's ad infinitum. And I said, isn't that what we mean when we sing the song Amazing Grace? When we've been there 10,000 years, it'll be as if we've just begun. And that's very true. And I've always looked at the entering into the world of God or living in the world of God like looking through a kaleidoscope. You know, you turn it and it's a beautiful constellation, and then you just turn it again and it's another beautiful constellation. And when you think you're running out of patterns, they just keep coming, one more beautiful than the other. So falling into God is like that. It's falling into an ocean of light. But it never gets boring. It's always new. It's always new. It's always amazing. It's always astounding. And you know, we catch glimpses of this in this world. You know, the thing that I preached on last Sunday, was it? No, the Sunday before last, that when we wore pink, Gaudete Sunday, the Sunday of joy. I used several examples to try to communicate what life with God or what life with Emmanuel, if we really knew, see, because the meaning of Christmas is Emmanuel, God with us. But if we knew God with us, we would have the same ecstatic experience that this guy had in the other world. You don't have to go to the other world to have an ecstatic experience with God. Now that doesn't happen naturally. It doesn't happen easily. I don't think it happens anywhere other than in contemplative prayer or in the practice of presence. When you're really present with somebody in perfect love, you have a kind of ecstasy. When you have no other agenda, you don't want to go anywhere, you're not in a hurry, you're just in a good mood, and you're there with them. There's a moment, it's like a time out of time. It's a moment, it's a little slice of eternity. The examples that I use to try to communicate what's at stake here. See, without joy, you can tell that no matter what they're mouthing religiously, no matter what they're saying, no matter what prayers they're saying, if there is no joy in their eyes, they don't know God. God knows them, but they don't know God. They just know their ideas of God, and they're being deceived because there's no joy. If you knew God, there would be joy. So the knowledge of God is always a kind of epiphany. And as one author I admire greatly, who articulated this just as I'm doing it, every experience of God is an epiphany. It's like you just can't believe it. He says, nobody, maybe except the saints, can sustain a state of epiphany. I don't believe that. I think you can. I'm praying that I will. I think for the most part I do, except Jessie knows me when I don't. She's seen me many times. I'm going to give you an example of a person I know who did live that way. But before I do that, I laid out 4 examples for the community here at St. Andrews when I was talking about, because it was the gospel of the visitation. Mary goes to see Elizabeth. We know it. I've preached on it 1,000 times. I've got a whole notebook of sermon notes on it, but it always comes down to one thing. But I said, there were no cell phones in those days. And, so all of a sudden, Mary shows up at the door. And doesn't it say that the moment your greeting sounded in my ear, the baby in my joy leaped for joy?
Yes.
And we have a phrase in our lexicon, jumping for joy. And I said, when 2 teenage girls meet after they've not seen each other for 10 years, they go, I can't believe it. Something like that happened with Mary and Elizabeth. I said, and if you've ever watched the show Seinfeld, I said, if you want to know what knowing God is like, it's like when Jerry would come in and say to Elaine, guess what? We got the trailer. And she would say, get out. She'd push him away. Get out of here. That's the kind of joy. Or the other image I used, during Christmas season, you see a lot of this on TV. So the high school girls are playing basketball, and then at halftime, their dad, who's been in Iraq for 2 years, comes out on the court, and you can see the moment of recognition, and then they just collapse with joy, or they start screaming, or they start crying, or they jump for joy. In each of those episodes, you have a little image of what it is to live in the light. And I said, if you want to see the face of God, just watch videos like that. You're seeing the face of God. Everything else is forgotten. And light and love are making their epiphanal appearance in those people. So there. I mean, the experience of God is always an ecstatic, take your breath away. And I don't want to put you off on this, and so that you walk away from here saying, well, then I must not know God. I'm really trying to say that contemplating the reality that everything that is a miracle at every moment from God, that everything that is light coming from light, to begin to realize that I am light, and Christ has already the light. Christ is the light of God. Christ is the begotten light of God, and in a certain sense, the created light of God. Light from light, God from God. Christ was not a created, he was a human being, a divine person, but he was the incarnation of the uncreated light. He's the incarnation of the uncreated light. And through the power of the Holy Spirit, that light is what constitutes or generates, that light is the light that generates the existence of every one of us and of every created object in this world at every moment, at the foundation, at the foundational point of every flower, of every blade of grass, of every star, of every leaf on a tree, and of every person. At the very root of it all, at every moment, there's a source generating light in the form that you see it in the world. So it's a created object filled with the light of God from a source outside of itself that makes the light present within the object, so that the object can glory in the light and be one with the light while remaining distinct from the light at the same time.
I have a question about childhood, and Sunday's gospel talks about Jesus at 12 years of age, still a child. His parents had taken him to Jerusalem, and then they were going home, and he stayed in Jerusalem without telling them. Mary spent 3 days in great anxiety looking for him.
Right.
Now, through the eyes of a human, I think he should have told his mother, and now she's in anxiety, and I'm thinking, God is perfect. Why didn't God let his mother know?
So Joe, I want to use another example here of how it would be possible to live continuously in the light. Joe has also thrown into the mix here a good conversational point. I'll have to hold on to it. If you didn't hear it on the Zoom, Joe was saying when Jesus was still a child, 12 years old, he went up to the temple with his parents for the Passover. And then when they returned, we know the story. He stayed back for 3 days and thereby throwing his mother into great anxiety. And Joe said, from a human standpoint, and there's the key phrase, right? From a human standpoint, that it seems like he should have told her. Okay, so I'm going to hold on to that for just a second. I'll try to weave it into what we're doing here. What I'm trying to say to you in these gatherings is that the whole point of the gatherings and the goal of the Christian life is to gradually reverse our way of seeing things. We no longer want to see the world or our mothers or our friends or God from a human standpoint. We want to begin to see the world from God's standpoint. And that is possible to us because the life of God is our life. Our life is the life of God. It's the ego that has turned the binoculars around in the wrong direction. So when we look at God or other people or how things happen in the world, we see them from the wrong end of the telescope. We see them as filled with things we don't like because we're seeing them through our own image and likeness. And our image and likeness is an image and likeness of distortion. Christ has come into the world to refresh or to give us a new initiation into the light of God that he is and that we are from the foundation of the world because we were conceived by God, for God, and in God. So the challenge of the spiritual life is to learn how to view ourselves and others and the world and every object through the light of God, not through our own light. And to our light, God's light can appear darkness. It's so bright, it's like walking out into, it takes a long time to acclimate our eyes to the light of God, but it is possible. The church actually is trying to introduce us to that light by taking us from total darkness when we're born and gradually introducing the light to us by teachings and ritualistic forms of worship, trying to turn up the light so that we are not blinded by the full light. But most people's eyes get acclimated to a certain level of illumination by the church, and that's as far as they want to go, except there's another degree or two, more than two. There's another degree to which the light can be turned up, which when it is, puts everything that went before that into momentary darkness until our eyes are perfectly acclimated to the fullness of God's light. And then we are able to look back both on our life and on our current form of worship and enter into those things, but in a much different way. We're able to enter into those things like people re-enter this life after having been brought into the light of God's love in the near-death experience. They come back, and I'll say, jumping ahead, we talked about the resurrection earlier. That's exactly what happened in the resurrection. Without having a near-death experience, the apostles and those to whom Jesus appeared, he appeared to them as one in the fullness of light from beyond the other part, from beyond death. So it's not that they had a near-death experience, it's that Jesus was now having a near-life experience, revealing to them the fullness of who he is beyond this world. And therefore they came back into the world not knowing how to do their religion anymore, not knowing how, not even knowing what to say, because they've been exposed to a mystery that transcends this world and makes this world's problems seem as nothing by contrast. So when I'm still grieved by the problems of this world, I mean, grieved in the sense that it fundamentally shakes my identity or my faith in God, or disrupts my relationships with praying, or disrupts my relationships with others. Whenever I allow myself to become victimized by negative thoughts, I'm living in the darkness. I'm colluding with the deceiver. I'm saying, yes, ain't it awful? The more I say, ain't it awful, I'm creating desolation for myself and for others. Okay. And of course, the whole spiritual life, all the disciplines of the spiritual life are how to move from darkness into light, and how to move from the light of religion into the light of perfect union with God. The goal of the church is perfect union with God in this life. Okay, doesn't mean doing away with all the other previous sacramental and devotional forms that help us get to that point. But once I enter into the light of God in the fullness that he abides in my own soul, once the ego is gone, once the veil between my true self and the life of God in me is gone, I will be a new creation, as St. Paul said. And then all things will look light to me. Okay. And that's the spiritual journey. That's the challenge of contemplative prayer. That's the challenge of the moral life. That's the spiritual journey, purgative, illuminative, and unitive phase of the spiritual life. Very few people, because of the deceiver, very few people in general are willing to let go of what is behind them to pursue what is in front of them. They grow comfortable, or they grow afraid of the darkness of the future. So they don't make that next step to surrendering completely to God. And nobody ever knows where another person is on the journey, and nobody should judge anybody else's journey, because in the end, it'll all be the same for us anyway. We'll enter into the light. And maybe some of us will say, gee, I wish I'd done this sooner. Who knows? There was a man, and I will get to Joe's thing here. We've got a few minutes left yet. But let me just tell you about one person that I know lived with a continuous awareness of God's immediate presence. And that is the meaning of Christmas. It's not just, St. Augustine said, Mary conceived Jesus in her heart before she conceived him in her womb, which means that the biological conception of Jesus in the womb of Mary was, as it were, a byproduct of a more spiritual connection she had with the light. The light assumed incarnate form in her because she was one with the light in the interiority of her true self. She was the person who lived constantly out of the identity that she is in God, with no other identity ever manufactured or adopted or created by her. So it was easy for her to look on everybody with mercy. And so with Jesus, it was axiomatic for him to have nothing but pity for poor sinners. That's what he has. He has pity.
God before the angel.
She was one with God before the angel came.
She was in the temple all the time.
That's right. She was in the temple of her soul all the time. They believe she also spent time in the actual temple. But it was so God, hail full of grace. The angel could have equally said, hail you who are living God's identity for you. Hail you who have no obstacle between being the person God wanted you to be and being the person you are. Hail to you who are perfect in every way. Now, the angel says, our guardian angels say that to us. Hail you who are perfect at the depths of your being. What's the word they use on ships when they're trying, ballast, throw away, get rid of everything that keeps you from seeing who you are in God. Our guardian angels are always trying to subtly lead us away from and towards those things that will strip us of our ego, strip us of artificiality, strip us and illumine us about the lies of the deceiver. Remember, the deceiver and the diabolos and the murderer. So he's a deceiver, a liar, a murderer from the beginning. He divides by deceiving. And as soon as he deceives us, we start judging people. When we judge people, we've opened up a divide between us and the person we're gossiping about. So it's all about closing that divide and not going there when we feel the tempter coming near us. So, to jump ahead here to this guy that I knew, he actually wasn't, he was a very devout Catholic. Actually, his name was Joe Evans. I think I've told you this story before, but I'm going to repeat it here. He was a professor at Notre Dame. Last time I was at Notre Dame with my son, we were at a Notre Dame football game, and it was a beautiful day. And at Notre Dame, they have this big 14-story library, and there's a reflecting pond right in front of it. And on the library is a picture of Jesus with his arms out. They call it Touchdown Jesus because he's standing like this. And I was telling my son, I said, I remember an October day just like this. It was perfectly beautiful. I was a second year student at Notre Dame. When I was a freshman, I started to study philosophy and theology, and one of my teachers said, you should take a course sometime from Professor Joe Evans. He's in the philosophy department. Mr. Evans had a reputation. You'd see him in the cafeteria. He was about very tall, like 6'4", 6'5", and very tall and thin. He was a professor of French as well. He had translated all of Jacques Maritain's works into English and was a well-known scholar. But he walked around. He was never married. He was the classical philosopher with his head in the clouds. And I said, is that the strange looking guy? He had a haircut. It was very kind of white walls at the side, and then it came out on the top like a palm tree. His haircut looked like a walking palm tree to me, And I would see him walking on the campus every once in a while, and he just always seemed to be elsewhere. So I never dared approach him, but I did sign up for his class. But I met him before I signed up for his class because I was on the way to baseball practice. And I had to go past the library over to the baseball field at Notre Dame. And Mr. Evans was sitting right by the reflecting pond in front of the library at Notre Dame, gazing off into the sky. And it was just the most perfect day in October. And I was filled with ecstatic joy to be at Notre Dame on a baseball scholarship. I was like, this doesn't get any better than that. And I guess my heart was just filled with joy. So I thought, I'll just introduce myself, So I came up to, he was sitting there, I didn't know if I could get his attention, and I said, are you Mr. Evans? And he turned towards me. Yeah, yes. And I said, well, my name's Phil Krill, and he's looking at me. And I started to feel uncomfortable. So I said, isn't it great to be at Notre Dame on a day like this? No. And they tell me I do the best Joe Evans impression ever. He goes like that. No, it's great. No, to be at Notre Dame, on a day like this. No, to be at Notre Dame on a day like this. No, it's great. to be at Notre Dame on a day like this. It's great.
What were his classes
But,
like?
but then again, it's just good to be.
Right.
And I said, I'll see you later, Mr. Evans. Good to meet you. And off I went to, yeah, so one of the questions was, what was it like to take him in class? The textbook for the class was The Little Prince.
Oh.
And the whole class was about some of the stuff I talked to you about in here, about God being the source of our being and nothing existing apart from God. But the key line in The Little Prince is that which is most important is invisible to the eye. And that was what the whole class centered around, that you have to be immersed in the invisible world before you can understand the visible world properly, because the visible world derives its numinosity from a source outside of itself, which is the uncreated light of God. Okay. Okay, so now to come back to Joe's question and to try to finish up with a little commentary on that. So from a human standpoint, or at least from Joe's human standpoint, it could seem inconsiderate, maybe even unchristian, not caring, not thoughtful, not polite, to, number one, stay back in Jerusalem on your own accord, and then not to tell your parents, hey, I'm going to hang around for a few days. I'll follow up in a week or so. So he didn't do any of that. And his mother was quite stressed out. Was she mad? Hard to imagine a woman not being upset, for sure. I'm sure she never sinned by the thought of anger. I don't even think she was tempted to do that. But she did give expression to her frustration. You can hear it in the Gospel of Luke. Son, are you not concerned that your father and I have been searching for you? And then, as if to add insult to injury, he turns to her and says, why were you looking for me? I mean, imagine her getting that reply. Why were you looking for me? It's like what he's actually, when you think of Jesus' interactions with his mother, he seems never to have been very nice. At Cana, she says, hey, they've got no wine. He says, how's that my problem? That's a literal translation of what he said. How's that my problem? So you can see that Jesus operates on a different level. He also calls her woman, which actually it's more of a term of affection, and it's actually a theological term where he's trying to signal to her, you represent humanity. He calls her madam. And by madam, he means the whole human race, the spouse of the Father. Don't you understand? So in this particular instance, though, he's particularly abrupt. Why were you searching for me? Like, you silly woman. Don't. And then he adds and then he gives the explanation. He said, did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? And then it doesn't say Mary said, oh boy, or put him in timeout. It says she pondered these things in her heart. Okay. So again, it's like what Jesus said to his apostles in the gospel. You are from below, I am from above. And he's come from above to elevate us to above, so that when we return to our bodies, or to our lives, to our bodies in the case of a near-death experience, but to our lives coming out of the Eucharist, coming out of contemplative prayer, coming out of a gathering like this, wherever we intentionally go towards the light to know God more deeply, we come out more illuminated, we come out more transfigured, provided our hearts are of the same disposition of Mary, let it be to me according to your word, and I pondered all these things in my heart. When you see a child rejoicing at Christmas, or you catch anybody exchanging the slightest look of light or love, ponder that in your heart. Recognize that when you see two people being nice to each other in the Dollar Tree because it's Christmas, when you see anybody doing the slightest gesture of love, understand you're looking at the face of God modulated to this world so you can get a little glimpse. And when enough of those little increments of light build up in your soul, you will become all light. You will begin to act like that yourself. When you don't have to have the life review after you die. You don't have to go through purgatory. You can just look back on your life and realize sin is where I cause hurt to others. My mother told me in second grade, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say anything at all. You know, don't say anything at all. Of course, we also need to be purified of the things we're saying that are ugly inside as well. You know, and God's in there. God. So the mystery of Christmas is that God dwells with us. The historical memory, I mean, I wanted to say another word too about the commercialization of Christmas. So Joe, I don't know if that answers it but God, the logic of light is a completely different logic. It's a complete different operating system than the one we operate with. And so we have to die. We have to die to our way of thinking. We have to die to our way of imagining. We have to go dark in order to be filled with the light. Or we have to have the darkness of the deception that's in our soul sucked out of us by the Holy Spirit, so that the light of God, which is present at the deepest level of our being, can flood our being and drive out the light. But every time I move towards the light, every time I say one prayer, every time I open my heart a little bit to the mystery, the light is lit again. The light is there, and the light conquers the darkness. Focus on the light. Don't curse the darkness. Build the light. Turn the light up. Avoid situations that are in darkness. When you see, so the great, so Christmas, I mean, I watched, what time is it? I always, just for my own sake, I don't know what, for what sake, I guess for nostalgia's sake, every Christmas, I reset the favorite channels on my cable TV to include the Hallmark movie channel, because they have, from Thanksgiving through Christmas, they have Christmas movies. And so here's what I want to say about that, and about the jingle bells downtown and all the, I mean, I think, it's become a completely secular, but you can watch 100, 200 Hallmark movies about Christmas, and you would never hear the name Jesus said. Okay, and yet, every actor in there is perfectly coiffed, and and all the snow is artificial, but it's an idealized form of Christmas, but it brings joy to people. That is the light of God making people happy who will only know him through watching Hallmark. I talked to Peter about, why doesn't everybody have the same kind of mystical Christianity that you and I are trying to promote? And he said, I believe it's genetic. He said, I believe some people are just wired not to be able to connect to anything I'm saying today in this gathering. He said, and it doesn't matter to God. He said he accommodates himself to every person because every person is loved with that same infinite love. They're just configured differently. He said, but everything about the light of God is so far beyond human comprehension that to try to describe it to anybody, especially in religious terms, is really to do it a disservice. He said, I would rather not talk at all. He said, that's why I came back and said, I have no faith. He started a Sunday gathering. Now, he used to be a congregational minister. Now he's on YouTube with a Sunday gathering like we have, right on Zoom. And you know what he calls it? Not church. The name of the service is Not Church.
That's good.
He says, because there's no church in God, there's nothing that we would account as religion exists in the life of God. all of these things are good, of course, and they're really beautiful when they are lived in the light of God. And sometimes even they serve as obstacles to us living in that light, but that's another discussion for another time. So, the world gets a kind of mercy during this season. There's kind of a secular bonhomie that goes on during this time. And that's the presence of God as well. I mean, the world will go back to its murderous ways soon enough. It's already got, I mean, and fighting over gifts and coals is also, the opposite of the season. But every once in a while, little epiphanies of love break out, even among people who don't know anything of God. So they do know God. They know God in the light and love that is in their life as they're able to understand it. We are gifted as Christians to know the name of the light, to know where the light comes from. And it is given to us to be like Mary, to conscientiously and intentionally cultivate the light within us. And when we do that, Christ himself, just as truly as he was conceived in Mary, is conceived in us. Think of yourself as pregnant with God. That's what I told the people. Mary had to go in haste to the hill country because she could not contain the realization that I'm pregnant with God. But the same thing can be said of you and me. I am pregnant with God. Every one of us, with respect to God, male and female, are feminine. We are the receivers of God. The life we have within us is the life of God within us. We are pregnant with God. And if a person begins to think of themselves that way, they will be as ecstatic going to the home of relatives or to others. You may not be able to talk like that to anybody else than people who are come here for this gathering because they'll think you're crazy. But you can still harbor the awareness in you, and you can realize that they are also pregnant with God. They just think they're going to find God under the tree when they're really finding it within themselves. But I'll tell you what, if you're aware of the presence of God within you, and if you're aware of your presence in God within you, it's contagious. And Peter says this, he says, when you see the body of Christ, I don't know if Peter says this, he says things like this. When you're aware of the whole humanity as one person, you realize that the only reason human beings exist is so that God can love himself in you through her. Our love for each other is God loving himself in and through us. It's love circulating while circulating among itself. It's the Trinity, it's the love of the Trinity circulating through the human race in such a way as to also give joy and glory and a theophanic existence to those through whom the love of God circulates. We are of that love, our substance is of that love, and we get to enjoy that love as well, but it's really God loving himself in us and through us and allowing us to be partakers of it at the same time. So I'm going to quit with that because I'm getting an important phone call that I have to return here in a second, but let's finish with the glory be. I'll return the phone call and then we'll talk more if we want to. Glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you.